My name's Mike Jeffries. I'm a qualified social worker. I'm currently working for Reed Social Care in South Wales. I've worked here in South Wales with Reed since 2001, full-time. Before that I was working part-time when I had some local authority responsibilities, but they kindly gave me permission to work with Reed part-time as well. And prior to that, I started off in working with Reed in 1989 in the Metropolitan Borough of Solihull.
How did you first get into social care?
I came into social work as a career, as a profession. Before social care was widened into that, and in the days when I first started, social work was divided up into three strands, which was essentially field work, which is what people like myself as qualified childcare officers, social workers do, based in offices who do home visits and so on, as opposed to residential workers, or indeed what we used to call domiciliary and daycare workers, who are people who deliver daycare services in daycare centres and things like that. But now, obviously, social care is an all-encompassing phrase, and that's good. But my place within that is that I still see myself as my roots being in social work, as a social worker, and to define within that again, I was in childcare right from the beginning, so I've always been someone who's specialised in work with children and families, and within that most of my practice work has been around child protection and around working in the legal system in courts. So it's at the sort of so-called heavy end of childcare, working with children and families.
What made you specialise within children's?
I suppose it was an interest. When I first started, which was more years ago than I care to remember, I came out of theological college, and I was looking for a career which represented the aspirations I had about wanting to do something purposeful for people. I started off doing a few months' work doing routine social work with older people. I was a social work assistant because I wasn't qualified when I started, and I carried a caseload of 250 routine cases from a social welfare officer who had a caseload of 450.
Wow.
And in the 5 months I worked with Frank, I managed to visit about 120 of those 250 people. But in that process, I was working in a town hall in London, and the acting children's officer had an office next door to the office I was working in. And he had an opportunity of 3 trainee childcare officers coming up, and he asked if I was interested, and I saw that as a route to becoming qualified, and so I said yes, and I stayed within the childcare specialism ever since. There's something unique about the flavour of childcare work, which is to do with protecting the vulnerable in terms of children, working with children, understanding with compassion the problems which parents face in facing the difficulties of trying to be a good parent these days, with all society's expectations and the problems which they face. Plus the elements of making sure that we can safeguard and protect the vulnerable, and try and get some measure of justice within that system.
I know this is probably quite a hard question, but what does a typical day look like to you?
Right, I'm no longer in child protection at the moment in my current assignment. If I talk about child protection, if I can go back to a job I had previously, because I worked over 7 years in Cardiff in basically a child in need child protection team, and spent a lot of time in court as a result of that. And if I focus on that, I carried a caseload of about 25 to 30 families, with children within those families. And most of that work was to do with issues where the parents, through various reasons, either through relationship difficulties, domestic abuse, substance misuse, mental health needs, or whatever, were unable to parent children to a standard which we would feel as, or which the courts would describe as being safe. And if you boil everything down, the care of children really depends on 3 core values, which is to do with nurture, to make sure the children fulfil their potential, and that they have the most beneficial and nurturing experience as a child to fit them for becoming an adult. Secondly, in terms of stability, where they actually have a sense where they're in a stable environment, they have an element of predicting what's going on, and it's safe, and that they have an understanding that the world is a safe place in which they can grow and develop. The longevity of the care arrangement. So essentially, you boil every child's life down into a sense of it's got to be nurturing, it's got to be enduring, it's got to be fit and will last throughout their childhood, forever for adulthood, and above all, it's got to be safe. And in looking at those three elements, that's essentially what child protection is all around, and making sure that children in need as well, at a lower level, where the risks are not so significant that they'd have to be removed from home, should all not go well. But the heavy end of that, you're trying to make judgments about whether children are going to be cared for in a good enough way. You're not asking for perfect parenting, but in a good enough way which is going to equip those children to become contented and meaningful and significant adults in society.
What would you say is the best part about your job?
But the satisfaction comes from meeting people, working with people, which is the driver for me, which is why I came into the job in the first place. Because people are infinitely varied, infinitely complex. No two people are ever the same. Everyone is unique. And if it doesn't sound a bit too hackneyed, if you have a sense of connection and compassion for other people, and you're not keen to rush in and make judgments about how they live their lives, if you can just step back for a moment from your life and see how somebody else is living their life and make connections with that, and the expectations and challenges society presents to them, and you want to try and help them resolve some of those difficulties and overcome them, so they feel more purposeful, they feel happier, they feel more fulfilled, and their children benefit. That gives you something in life which no amount of money can give. The reward in actually doing it, in looking children in the face and seeing how happy they are, through some of the small things you may have been able to do, through trying to restore some sense of balance in relationships, trying to get people to understand one another so there's less conflict in their interpersonal relationship, trying to arrange things so that even difficult messages can be understood and you can take away some of the hard edges in people's lives. That's tremendously satisfying.
And if you were speaking to somebody who was looking to get into social work, what piece of advice would you give to them?
You need to ask yourself seriously whether you really want to do this, because certainly and if I just focus again back on child protection and in children and families work, you've got to be prepared not only to learn and carry on learning, because the day you stop learning is the day you should leave. So you've got to be prepared to carry on learning. Never think you know it all. You've got to have an infinite well of compassion and empathy and understanding for other people. You've got to be able to put your own needs on the back burner, and you've got to have a fairly stable life in order to be able to withstand the pain and the suffering other people will give you. And if you're going to be meaningful in this, you're going to have to learn to experience other people's pain. And that comes from within. That's something which is part of your personality, and you either have it or you don't. Training and understanding and education makes you better, but it won't give you those core instincts, that core ability to be able to make connections and to do that. And you've got to know yourself pretty well. And you know you're never going to change society that much, but if you can just change it for a few people's lives, for a few minutes, a few hours, perhaps a few years if you're lucky, then that's got to be worthwhile.
And if you could sum up the job in 3 words, what would they be?
It's challenging, it's complex, and it's rewarding.
And so obviously you've said that you've been with Reed since 1989.
Yes.
On and off.
Yeah.
And can you explain why you've stayed with Reed?
I can. I mean, at the time when I was living down in South Wales, and I'd been out of social work for a brief period of time. I took a career break and wasn't quite sure which direction my life was going to go in. And then thought, well, I'll go back and just do temporary social work, because that's something I knew. I've done it for a good number of years before. And whilst other opportunities in life may come along. And so I was looking around for temporary social work, and there was no temporary vacancies in South Wales at that time. And so I thought I'd work for an agency. And I'd employed agency workers as a manager when I'd worked in Kent previously. And so there were only a few agencies functioning in the late 80s. And one of whom was Reed, and Reed was the only agency which had an office outside of London, and it only had one office, and that was in Birmingham. But Birmingham was doable in terms of commuting for me from where I lived. So I started working in Birmingham, and I did 5 months there, and then they asked me to go and be a local manager in Solihull Hospital, and then it led on from there. And then I got into a joint management job in a what was then known as a community mental handicap team, now a community team for people with learning disabilities. Then the 89 Children Act came along, and then we set up a joint health and social services children with disabilities team. And throughout that time, and I've remained with Reed, I have high professional standards myself, and I would expect that of any agency. And I've worked with so many colleagues who've worked for other agencies who've come and gone and so on. But I stayed with Reed, and what attracted me to Reed in the first place was that it's an agency which is professional, it knows what it's doing, it's got its own set standards and values. But I've always found it tremendously supportive. I found the people who work for Reed have been very understanding and supportive of me and the work I'm trying to do with the local authorities with whom I've been working. And for that sense, I've always said to anyone I've ever worked with, I would never leave Reed. Reed is the only organisation I would ever want to work for on a temporary basis. And hey, I've done 25 years, so that's got to say that I'm pretty satisfied with that.
Yeah.